Welcome back. So finally we are at the last section of our lecture. We are still talking about the digestive system and now we'll talk about the hindgut derivatives. In this section we'll be talking about the hindgut, that is how various components of the hindgut are formed. We'll see what are the various components of the hindgut, how their mesentery is formed. We'll talk about the terminal portion of the hindguts, that is the rectum and the anal canal. We'll see how different components of the digestive system contribute to the formation of the anal canal, and finally we'll see the fixation of mesentery and the formation of adult form of mesentery that is found in the adult human. So getting into it, first of all we'll talk about the segments or the portions of the hindgut. So hindgut consists of the left 1/3 or the distal 1/3 of the transverse colon. Then we have the descending colon. Then we have the sigmoid colon. Then rectum, and finally the upper part of the anal canal. So this is the proximal 1/3 of the transverse colon. Then we have this descending colon. Then we have the sigmoid colon, then we have the rectum and the upper part of the anal canal. This is the entirety of the hindgut. We're talking about the development of the transverse colon now. So the right 2/3 are developed from the midgut, and the left 1/3 or the distal 1/3 is formed by the hindgut. Similarly, it would be supplied by the arteries of the hindgut, of the midgut and the hindgut respectively. So the right 2/3 would be supplied by the artery of the midgut. The artery of the midgut was the superior mesenteric artery, and the remaining 1/3 or the distal 1/3 would be supplied by the artery of the hindgut, which is the inferior mesenteric artery. So the left 1/3 develops from the hindgut and is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. So the descending and the sigmoid colon, they are simply derived from the hindgut. There are no contributions from the midgut whatsoever. They are supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery, which is the artery of the hindgut. So now we'll talk about the development of rectum. So the terminal dilated portion of the hindgut, this is the terminal dilated portion, this which is distal to cloaca. This is the cloaca, so it is distal to cloaca, and this is known as the distal to allantois. This is distal to the allantois, is known as cloaca. So it is divided into two parts by the urorectal septum. So this is the urorectal septum in green, which is being developed. This urorectal septum, it divides this cloaca into two parts: a ventral part, which is known as the urogenital sinus, and a narrow dorsal part, which is known as the primitive rectum. So again, the development of rectum takes place from cloaca, which is the dilated terminal portion of the hindgut. It lies distal to the allantois. Then there is development of urorectal septum in this cloaca, which divides this cloaca into two parts. There's a broad ventral part, which is known as the primitive urogenital sinus, and there is a narrow dorsal part, which is known as the primitive rectum. This is the urogenital septum, urorectal septum that has formed. This is the urogenital sinus, the primitive urogenital sinus, and this is the primitive rectum. Now, this urogenital sinus gives rise to the urinary bladder and the urethra, and the primitive rectum, it forms the rectum and the upper part of the anal canal. So now we'll talk about the development of the anal canal. So anal canal has two developmental sources, the hindgut and the proctodeum. So as you can see in the figure, this is the hindgut, this is the proctodeum. Initially the hindgut and the proctodeum are separated by a membrane. This is known as the anal membrane or the cloacal membrane. After a while, there is disappearance of the anal or the cloacal membrane, and they become continuous with each other, the upper and the lower portion of the anal canal, and there is disappearance of the anal membrane. It is now marked by the pectinate lines, which mark the site of the union between the hindgut and the proctodeum. So the upper half of the anal canal is endodermal, and it develops from the primitive rectum. So lower half of the anal canal is endodermal in origin and develops from the anal pit, which is known as the proctodeum. So these are the differences between the upper and the lower parts of the anal canal. So developmentally, the upper half develops from the primitive rectum, which is endodermal in origin, and the lower half of the anal canal develops from the proctodeum or the anal pit, which is ectodermal in origin. So the arterial supply of the upper half of the anal canal is superior rectal artery, which is a branch of the inferior mesenteric artery, which is the artery of the hindgut. And the lower half of the anal canal, the blood supply is inferior rectal artery, which is not a branch of the inferior mesenteric artery. Now the venous drainage is via superior rectal vein, which goes into the portal vein, and the lower half of anal canal, we have the inferior rectal vein, which are actually systemic veins. Then the nerve supply in the upper half of anal canal is autonomic, and the nerve supply in the lower half of the anal canal is somatic. Now let's talk about the mesentery. So while talking about development of the gut, each section of the gut had its own mesentery. Now let's see what happened to the mesentery of various sections of the gut. So once the rotation of the gut is complete, which was 270° anti-clockwise, the mesentery of duodenum, so the mesentery of duodenum, except for the first inch of its first part, the ascending colon. So the mesentery of the duodenum lies here somewhere. The duodenum and jejunum are not shown in the figure, only terminal portion of the ileum is being shown. The descending colon, the ascending colon, so ascending colon, the descending colon, and the rectum, they fuse with the parietal peritoneum, which lines the posterior abdominal wall. So important is to remember this sites, the mesentery of the duodenum, except for the first inch of its first part, that is pylorus is still covered by the duodenal mesentery. Except for that, the entire duodenum, then the ascending colon and the descending colon and rectum, the mesentery of these structures, they fuse with the parietal peritoneum of the posterior abdominal wall and are obliterated. As a result, these structures become retroperitoneal. So what are the retroperitoneal gut structures? They are the duodenum, except for the first inch of its first part, the ascending colon, the descending colon, and the rectum. So what happens to the rest of it? The original mesentery, now it persists as mesentery of the small intestine. This is the mesentery proper, mesentery of the small intestines. It includes mesentery of the duodenum and that of the ileum. So mesentery of the transverse colon, this is the mesentery of the transverse colon. Now we have mesentery of the sigmoid colon, this is the mesentery of the sigmoid colon. And mesentery of the appendix, also known as the mesoappendix, this is the mesentery of the appendix. So these are the four parts where the mesenteries are actually retained, and these are the parts which are engulfed by the mesentery. These include the mesentery proper, that is mesentery of the small intestine. That includes mesentery of jejunum and mesentery of ileum. Then we have mesentery of the transverse colon. Then we have mesentery of the sigmoid colon, and finally the mesoappendix. So this was all about this section. In this section, we talked about how various derivatives are developed from the hindgut. The adult derivatives of hindgut involve the distal 1/3 of the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the upper half of the anal canal. We talked about the development of rectum, then we saw how anal canal had two separate developmental origins, and finally we talked about the formation of adult mesentery. We saw how important structures went retroperitoneal and what structures were retained within the mesentery. I hope you found this lecture entertaining, as well as it was a good learning experience for you. For further such lectures, keep watching sqadia.com.